The August evening sky draped Manhattan in molten copper when Thaddeus Merriweather III stepped out of the boardroom with a single sentence echoing in his mind, "Marry within 30 days or surrender the empire." The ultimatum came dressed in polite legalese, yet its claws were iron. Investors wanted a wholesome image for the upcoming IPO, and a bachelor CEO whose last tabloid mention involved a jet ski race around Capri no longer fit the prospectus. Thad's polished shoes clicked across marble as he crossed the lobby of Merriweather Vox. Every surface reflected a man who should have felt invincible, 31, heir to a dynasty of news networks, magazine titles, and streaming platforms, but each reflection now carried the faint tremor of panic. He passed employees who greeted him with careful smiles, unaware their futures hung on the question of his marital status. Instead of descending to the chauffeured car waiting on 57th, Thad veered toward a service elevator rarely used except by maintenance crews. He pressed the button for the roof. As the elevator climbed, he loosened his tie and felt the weight of generations tighten around his chest. His grandfather had built the first radio station in a rented basement, his father had syndicated it into a coast-to-coast powerhouse. Thad, the visionary son, was supposed to launch them into the era of immersive media. All that promise now balanced on a wedding band that did not exist. When the doors slid open, a warm gust swept in, carrying the scent of asphalt baked all day in summer heat. The rooftop helipad stretched like a private continent above the city. Neon billboards flickered below, and traffic hummed like distant surf. Thad walked to the edge, craving the illusion of distance from boardroom politics. A soft metallic click drew his attention. On the far side of the helipad, a woman knelt by a tripod, adjusting the lens of an old Leica. She wore black jeans flecked with paint, a loose gray t-shirt, and a camera harness crisscrossing her shoulders like a bandolier. Copper hair escaped a messy knot, catching the dying light. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice the CEO of the building watching her trespass on corporate airspace. Thad cleared his throat. The woman started, steadying the tripod before it toppled. She looked at him with eyes the color of storm glass, gray with a rim of green, evaluating whether to run or stand her ground. He raised a hand in apology rather than accusation. She relaxed an inch but did not step back from her camera. He asked who had granted her access. She replied that the security guard downstairs owed her a favor and that the rooftop had the best angle for a time-lapse of the sunset swallowing Midtown. Her voice carried a sand-polished confidence, as if explaining art to an impatient tourist. Thad felt the corporate persona slip, the situation was too surreal for rehearsed charm. He admitted he could use a distraction and asked if she minded company. She shrugged, neither welcoming nor refusing him, then returned to adjusting the aperture. For several minutes they stood in companionable silence. Clouds unfurled like brushstrokes across the horizon, igniting in purples and golds. Through her viewfinder she captured the moment the Chrysler Building's spire pierced a band of crimson. He watched her instead of the skyline, noticing how she bit her lower lip when the light shifted, how her fingers hovered before each shot like a pianist above ivory. The city dimmed, and with it the tension inside him began to unknot. He asked her name. She answered, Kalista Rowan Hale, while keeping her eye on the viewfinder. She added that she was a freelance photojournalist, currently broke, perpetually behind on rent, but chasing a portfolio that might one day hang in MoMA. Thad introduced himself simply as Thad. He waited for recognition. People usually connected Merriweather to Vox within seconds, but her brow stayed smooth. She asked if he worked in the building. He said yes, in a manner that invited no further questions. Night settled fully, and the camera shutter clicked at intervals, recording the city's lights blooming like constellations. Kalista glanced at him sideways, sensing the restlessness beneath his calm posture. She remarked that he looked like a man deciding whether to jump or to fly. The comment landed harder than she could have known. He surprised himself by telling her about the board's ultimatum. No names, no specifics, just the outline, a forced marriage for optics, 30 days to secure it, and an empire at stake. He spoke without quotes, his words tumbling in a single stream as though the absence of punctuation might hide the absurdity. Kalista listened, arms folded against the breeze. When he finished, she exhaled a short laugh, not mocking, more incredulous. She said the story sounded like a studio pitch for a romantic comedy nobody would believe. Thad agreed, but the board was not laughing. A long pause followed. Helicopter rotors droned somewhere above the Hudson. The city kept pulsing, indifferent to individual crises. Kalista began dismantling her setup, sliding the Leica into its worn leather case. She lifted the tripod over one shoulder and turned to leave, but halted as if reconsidering. She asked what kind of woman the board expected him to marry. He answered, someone polished, pedigreed, scandal-proof. She chuckled, said that ruled her out on all counts, then surprised them both by asking what he would offer a hypothetical bride in return. The question struck him as simultaneously mercenary and fair. He thought of the philanthropic fund languishing unused, the creative grants he had proposed but never implemented. He said he could finance any dream, provided the dreamer was brave enough to chase it. Kalista's expression shifted, calculation flickering behind curiosity. She set the tripod down, crossed her arms, and studied him as though framing a portrait. Finally she said she had student loans heavy as anchors and a vision for an exhibition called Faces of Disquiet, portraits of people caught between personal chaos and public facade. She lacked only the resources to finish it. Thad heard himself suggest an arrangement that would satisfy both their needs. A marriage of convenience for 6 months, long enough to impress investors, after which they would part ways amicably. In return he would underwrite her exhibition, cover her debts, and secure a venue in any city she chose. Kalista tapped a finger against her lower lip, weighing the madness. She asked if he was serious. He said the board meeting had stripped him of the luxury of jest. Another silence, but this one vibrated with possibility rather than dread. Kalista extended her hand, palm up, as though asking for a camera rather than a life. Thad placed his hand in hers. The rooftop lights flickered on, bathing them in artificial daylight, and somewhere below a taxi horn wailed. They shook once, a pact sealed without lawyers or witnesses. Kalista picked up her gear, and together they walked to the service elevator, descending into a future neither could yet imagine. As the doors closed, the city skyline disappeared behind steel, and with it the last remnants of Thad's old life. Deep in her camera bag, a fresh roll of film waited to capture the chaos about to unfold. The service elevator slid open onto the executive floor just before midnight, spilling Thad and Kalista into a corridor of muted carpeting and glass walls that reflected their unlikely partnership back at them. The building was nearly empty, the hush broken only by the low hum of HVAC vents and the occasional ping of distant elevators settling for the night. Thad gestured toward a corner office whose frosted door bore no nameplate. It had once belonged to the chief legal officer, but the man had retired and the space now served as an ad hoc war room for sensitive negotiations. Inside, floor-to-ceiling windows framed the nocturnal skyline, and a single desk lamp cast a pool of light across a polished conference table. Thad keyed in a passcode on a wall panel. Hidden cabinets slid open, revealing a stocked minibar, a stack of branded notebooks, and, most important for the moment, an encrypted tablet linked to the company's legal servers. Kalista drifted to the window, her reflection hovering against the city like a double exposure. Thad powered up the tablet and typed a brief directive to the general counsel, marking it urgent but confidential. Within minutes a soft chime signaled a secure video link. The general counsel, Marjorie Penn, appeared in a window, silver-haired and sleepless in her Connecticut study. She did not raise an eyebrow at the sight of her CEO in shirtsleeves beside an unfamiliar woman. Years of crisis management had trained her to bypass curiosity in favor of compliance. Thad summarized the situation in precise legal language. He required a marital contract that could withstand regulatory scrutiny, media intrusion, and any challenge from dissenting shareholders. It must be drafted by dawn, and it must be airtight. Marjorie requested the prospective spouse's full legal name. Kalista stepped forward, palms damp but voice steady, supplying the information. Marjorie asked for her date of birth, social security number, and current address. Kalista recited them while Thad watched the cursor fly across Marjorie's screen, clauses assembling like a fortress in real time. When the preliminary document arrived, 72 pages in densely packed legal prose, Thad mirrored it onto the room's wall display. Lines of text scrolled like stock tickers, representations and warranties, confidentiality provisions, morality clauses, non-disparagement terms, financial consideration schedules. Kalista scanned the wall, jaw set. She pointed to a section deep in the boilerplate where the firm had inserted a prohibition against romantic entanglement outside the contract's scope. The clause stated that neither party would develop emotional dependency or intimate attachment, as such outcomes could compromise the agreement's integrity. Kalista retrieved a fountain pen from her camera bag, the same pen she used to jot exposure notes in field journals. She crossed the room, uncapped it, and in a single deliberate stroke slashed through the paragraph. Her handwriting flowed beneath the redacted text, "Feelings are not subject to contract." She stepped back, arms folded, challenging Thad to object. He studied the ink bleeding across the projection, then turned to Marjorie's startled face on the tablet. He instructed her to remove the clause entirely. Marjorie hesitated only a heartbeat before nodding. The cursor resumed its dance. They continued line by line. Kalista insisted on retaining the rights to any photographic work produced during the term of marriage, even if Merriweather Vox distributed the images. Thad agreed, adding a rider that the company would fund an exhibition tour in at least 3 international cities. Kalista demanded an escape hatch. If either party engaged in fraudulent behavior that endangered the other's safety or reputation, the marriage could be dissolved immediately with full financial settlement in her favor. Thad surprised her by increasing the settlement amount unprompted. Negotiations stretched into the early hours, fueled by black coffee and the low-grade adrenaline of imminent transformation. At one point Thad's phone buzzed with a calendar alert reminding him of a breakfast interview with a tech magazine. He silenced it, aware that his life was already off-script. Kalista, meanwhile, opened her Leica, removed the spent roll, and slid in fresh film. She captured a shot of the contract projected against the glass, city lights shimmering behind the legal jargon, evidence, she said, that history often begins in fluorescent rooms long after the world has gone to sleep. Shortly after 4, Marjorie transmitted the final draft, now 68 pages but far more lethal. Thad printed 2 copies on archival bond paper stored in the credenza. The pages emerged warm and smelling faintly of toner, like a freshly minted future. He laid them side by side on the table, placed a pen atop each stack, and waited. Kalista approached first. She read the title, Mutual Alliance and Matrimonial Accord, then flipped to the signature page. The room's silence thickened around the moment. Without looking at Thad, she pressed the nib to paper and signed, the loops of her name confident, almost defiant. Thad took the second pen. His signature, practiced from years of autographs and endorsements, flowed quickly, but as he wrote he felt an unfamiliar tremor at the base of his spine, a current of anticipation rather than fear. He dated the document, set the pen down, and exhaled. A digital timestamp appeared on the screen confirming receipt of the executed contract. Marjorie's voice crackled through the speaker, congratulating them in her precise monotone and reminding Thad of the next legal steps: obtain a marriage license, schedule a public ceremony, prepare press releases. She signed off, and the tablet went dark. Kalista rolled the contract into a tube and slid it into her camera bag beside the fresh film. She said the document was now art as much as agreement. Thad laughed softly, rubbing the back of his neck, and admitted he had never felt less corporate in his corporate headquarters. They left the office together, lights dimming automatically behind them. In the corridor Kalista paused at a framed photograph of Thad's father shaking hands with a former president. She studied the image, then glanced at Thad, as if measuring him against the lineage. He met her gaze without flinching. Downstairs the dawn was just beginning to thin the night sky. A cab idled at the curb, summoned by Thad's assistant hours earlier and now driven by a man half asleep over the wheel. Thad asked Kalista where she wanted to be dropped. She gave an address in Williamsburg, then added that her apartment was small and cluttered but the coffee was excellent. Thad hesitated only a moment before sliding into the cab beside her. As the car pulled away from the curb, the Merriweather Vox Tower receded in the rear window, its spire catching the first pink streaks of morning. Thad watched the building shrink, feeling as though he were watching his old life fold into a postcard while an uncharted map unfurled ahead. Kalista opened her camera bag, retrieved the Leica, and snapped a candid frame of him against the window. No contract clause could stop her from chronicling the transformation already at work behind his eyes. The shutter clicked, sealing the instant on silver halide. The city's streets blurred by, and the two strangers bound by fresh ink sped toward a dawn that belonged to neither of them yet promised everything. Thad woke to the muffled percussion of rain against his bedroom windows and the faint scent of lilies that had infiltrated the penthouse overnight. A fleet of event planners had swept through while he slept, leaving behind test bouquets and swatches of ivory silk. By 8:30 he was suited in charcoal bespoke, though the tie remained draped around his neck like an unfinished sentence. Kalista arrived with her Leica slung crossbody and hair still damp from the downpour, refusing the entourage of stylists that had assembled in the foyer. She wore denim and a vintage band t-shirt, explaining that no one could ruin a dress she had yet to put on. Thad's personal assistant led her to a guest suite where the gown, a column of off-white silk designed overnight by an up-and-coming atelier, waited on a dress form. Kalista ran her fingers over the fabric, murmuring that it felt too smooth to belong in real life, then set the camera on a vanity and began to document the room, the pins still stuck in the hem, the loose threads, the post-it notes scribbled with last-second adjustments. By noon the rain had stopped, leaving the city rinsed and reflective. A convoy of black SUVs carried the wedding party downtown to the Astoria Athenaeum, a private library built in the 1880s whose reading room would serve as the chapel. The space smelled of lemon oil and parchment. Rows of mahogany shelves soared toward a domed ceiling where a chandelier the size of a small car hung suspended in crystal splendor. Event staff unfurled a cream aisle runner between the stacks, while florists arranged cascades of white wisteria along the banisters. Thad paced near the dais, fielding texts from board members already jockeying for seating prominence. Each ping tightened a coil inside him until Kalista's arrival cut through the tension. She stepped into the reading room transformed, the silk gown molded to her frame, a single silver cuff on her wrist, hair twisted up with loose tendrils softening her jaw. She carried the Leica instead of a bouquet, a choice that drew murmurs from the publicist but no protest from Thad. He met her halfway down the aisle, offering an arm, his pulse suddenly steadier. The officiant, a retired judge known for discretion, took his place beneath the stained-glass oculus. Guests filled velvet chairs, tech moguls, senators, fashion editors, a sprinkling of distant Merriweather cousins. A string quartet began a Bach adagio that vibrated through the library's wooden ribs. Kalista lifted the camera, framing the faces turned expectantly toward her. She captured a hedge fund billionaire adjusting his cufflinks, a society matron blinking back strategic tears, Thad's mother smoothing non-existent wrinkles from her skirt. Every click of the shutter felt like a subversive heartbeat inside the orchestrated tableau. The judge beckoned them forward. Kalista lowered the Leica and slid her hand into Thad's. The contract required them to exchange vows composed by corporate communications, but Thad had rewritten his that morning on hotel stationery. As he spoke, voice pitched low, eyes fixed on hers, Kalista sensed a tremor of sincerity that did not fit the script. She answered with the vows she had drafted on the back of a receipt in the SUV, promising curiosity instead of obedience, truth instead of perfection. The quartet paused for the exchange of rings. An assistant stepped forward with a velvet box, but at that instant the lights flickered. A collective intake of breath rippled through the room as chandeliers and sconces dimmed to embers. The judge hesitated, looking to the event coordinator, who mouthed an apology and signaled backstage electricians. Above them, the great chandelier emitted a metallic groan. Thad glanced up just as one of the supporting cables twitched like a violin string under too much tension. The crystal behemoth swayed, prisms scattering fractured rainbows across the shelves. Gasps erupted. Someone shouted to clear the aisle. Time collapsed into a single, silent instant before violence. Kalista felt the floor tilt beneath her perception as shards of light spun across Thad's face. Without thinking she dropped the camera. Later the film would show nothing but a smear of motion, and lunged, shoving him sideways. The chandelier's chain snapped with a report like gunfire. 3,000 pounds of crystal and bronze plunged, obliterating the spot where Thad had stood a heartbeat earlier. The impact shattered centuries of hush. Books flew from shelves, glass sprayed like surf. Kalista hit the floor on her shoulder, a sting of pain ricocheting through bone. She tasted copper, realized it was blood from a cut that bisected her cheek. Thad lay half atop her, eyes wide, his breath a ragged cadence against her ear. Security rushed in, followed by medics and frantic planners. Guests stumbled to their feet, some filming with phones, others herding children toward exits. The judge, dusted in plaster, tried to restore order but his voice dissolved in the chaos. Kalista sat up slowly, wincing as paramedics checked the gash on her face. One offered a compress. She pressed it to her cheek but kept scanning the wreckage for her camera. The Leica lay near a toppled globe, dented but intact. She crawled to it, ignoring the protests of a medic, and cradled the battered body as if it were alive. Thad, unhurt save for bruises blooming beneath his suit, knelt beside her. He reached to wipe a streak of blood from her collarbone, then stopped, his hand hovering as though the contact might ignite something irreversible. Kalista met his gaze. Around them sirens wailed, dust drifted through shafts of emergency light, and the chandelier lay in ruin, but in that breath between alarms she saw his expression shift from shock to gratitude to something deeper. A publicist pushed through the circle of responders, phone pressed to her ear, demanding a statement. Thad stood, straightened his jacket, and said the ceremony would resume elsewhere once safety was assured. Cameras flashed as he extended a hand to Kalista. She took it, rising with the Leica dangling from her wrist like proof of survival. Blood stained the bodice of her gown in an abstract bloom that would later appear on front pages worldwide. Outside, rain began again, a soft percussive cleansing. Thad guided her to a waiting ambulance not for treatment but privacy. Inside, he found a sterile wipe and gently cleaned the cut, hands surprisingly steady. Kalista watched him, realizing the contract's lines had already blurred. She had saved his life instinctively, not transactionally, and he was caring for her with a tenderness unmentioned in any clause. The ambulance door remained open to the library steps where guests gathered under umbrellas, rumors sparking like static. Kalista lifted the Leica one-handed and captured Thad silhouetted against the flashing lights, his tie askew, eyes shadowed yet luminous. She sensed the photograph would become iconic, the moment the empire tilted, but in the hush that followed the shutter's click she felt something shift inside her, an aperture widening to let in more than light. A fire marshal approached to interview them about the accident. As Thad answered, Kalista replayed the fall in her mind, the flicker of lights, the tremor of cable, the timing too precise to be chance. A suspicion took root, cold and insistent. She glanced at Thad, wondering if he felt it too, but his attention was on the marshal, voice calm, almost regal, as he recounted the seconds that nearly ended everything. Sirens faded, replaced by the steady patter of rain. The medics cleared them to leave, recommending stitches for Kalista's cheek. She refused the hospital, insisting the wound be cleaned and closed in private. Thad ordered the driver to the penthouse, ignoring the planners who clamored for a rescheduled ceremony. As the car merged into traffic, Kalista leaned back, eyelids heavy, but her mind raced with the physics of falling chandeliers and the politics of fear. Thad's hand rested on the seat between them, palm up, an unspoken question. She placed her fingers over his, neither of them speaking, the city's blurred light stitching a fragile seam between catastrophe and whatever came next. The elevator whisked them to the top floor, its mirrored walls reflecting a couple that looked more like survivors of a street riot than newlyweds. Kalista's gown, once pristine, now bore a crimson slash across the bodice, and Thad's shirt was stippled with plaster dust. The doors opened onto the penthouse foyer, a hushed expanse of marble and glass that seemed to recoil from their disarray. House staff hurried forward, but Thad waved them off, steering Kalista down a side corridor toward the kitchen where the light was softer and the air smelled faintly of vanilla and citrus polish. He fetched the medical kit his mother had insisted be kept in every residence. Under recessed lights he unwrapped butterfly bandages, antiseptic swabs, and a slim vial of surgical glue. Kalista perched on a barstool, watching him line the supplies in neat rows as though preparing for delicate surgery. When he dabbed antiseptic on her cheek the sting made her flinch, but his touch remained steady, almost reverent, and she realized with a jolt that no one had ever treated her injury, minor as it was, with such care. Thad apologized for the burn of the alcohol wipe, then paused, eyebrows knitting as if he were about to confess something monumental. Instead he simply blew gently on the cut to dry the antiseptic before applying the glue. The sensation, cool breath, warm fingers, sent an inexplicable shiver down her spine. She reminded herself that adrenaline was notorious for confusing the body's signals, yet when he secured the final bandage she felt the flutter of something more lasting than shock. With the immediate crisis handled, he opened the Sub-Zero refrigerator, bypassing imported caviar and artisanal cheeses to retrieve a take-and-bake pizza that one of his assistants kept on hand for late-night work sessions. He preheated the oven, then rummaged through cupboards until he produced a half-empty bottle of Pappy Van Winkle. Kalista's eyebrows lifted. She'd once photographed a bourbon auction where a bottle like this had fetched the down payment on a Brooklyn brownstone. Thad shrugged, saying his father collected rare spirits the way other men collected cuff links, and tonight felt like a night to drink the expensive stuff. They sat on the kitchen floor while the pizza baked, backs against cabinet doors, legs stretched across cool tiles. Kalista slipped off her heels, absurdly delicate given the day's events, and flexed her toes, savoring the relief. Thad loosened his tie at last, tossing it onto the island like a snake shed of its skin. He poured 2 fingers of bourbon into crystal tumblers and handed her one. She sniffed the caramel oak fumes, then took a sip that burned sweetly down her throat. Silence settled, but it was a comfortable hush rather than an awkward void. Rain tapped the floor-to-ceiling windows in erratic rhythms, as though the storm itself were trying to eavesdrop. Thad broke the quiet first, confessing that he had replayed the chandelier's fall 1,000 times on the ride home, each iteration ending with a different gruesome outcome. He admitted he'd been frightened before, hostile takeovers, death threats from disgruntled ex-employees, but nothing had ever felt so intimate, so calculated. His voice cracked when he said he kept seeing the moment Kalista shoved him, the look of fierce concentration on her face, as if she had rehearsed heroism all her life. Kalista tipped her head back against the cabinet, studying the recessed lights overhead. She told him she hadn't thought at all, that instinct had propelled her. She mentioned growing up with a firefighter father who drilled her in situational awareness the way other dads drilled free throws. She added that part of her brain was already cataloging the incident for an exposé she might write someday, though she doubted any magazine would let the CEO's wife publish a scandal about his own wedding. Thad chuckled, the sound soft and weary, then sobered. He confessed his greatest fear, that he would inherit not just his father's empire but his emotional vacancy. The elder Merriweather, legendary for business acumen, had been equally legendary for indifference to anything outside quarterly earnings. Thad admitted he had spent years cultivating a veneer of charm while secretly terrified the void beneath it was genetic. He took another sip of bourbon and said that when Kalista crossed out the clause about feelings being forbidden, he felt something break open, an interior door he'd kept bolted shut. Kalista turned the glass between her palms, watching amber swirl against cut crystal. She admitted her own fear, that every story, when stripped of glamour, resolved into the same cliché, people wanting more than they dared claim. She said photography was her rebellion, a way to freeze the precise instant before cynicism set in. She added, almost shyly, that the instant she shoved him aside had felt like one of those frames, pure, unedited life. The oven timer chimed. They rose, plates clattered, cheese bubbled. Thad sliced the pizza with a chef's knife too large for the task, sauce splattered onto the white marble. Kalista snapped a photo of the mess, laughing that perfection was overrated. They ate straight from the cutting board, grease pooling in the grooves, bourbon chasing each bite. At some point Thad's jacket slipped from his shoulders and Kalista's gown loosened at the back, threads of formality unraveling stitch by stitch. After the last slice disappeared, Thad pulled himself onto the island countertop and swung his legs like a boy on a dock. Kalista leaned against the opposite edge, camera poised. Through the viewfinder she saw him not as the tabloid-polished mogul but as a man exhausted, grateful, and unguarded. She clicked the shutter, the flash briefly illuminating freckles she hadn't noticed and the faint bruise forming along his jaw. He asked to see the shot. She turned the Leica so he could peer through the tiny playback window. He smiled, soft, surprised, almost vulnerable, and asked if she ever stepped in front of her own lens. She said rarely. He said tonight should be an exception. She hesitated, then set the camera on a stack of cookbooks, angling it toward the island. She twisted the mechanical timer, 10 seconds, and hurried to perch beside him. They faced forward, shoulders brushing, the bourbon warmth spreading outward until it met the storm-cooled glass of the windows. The shutter snapped. For a breath neither moved, as if the photograph might not develop if they shifted too soon. When she retrieved the camera, Thad slid to the floor, rummaged in a drawer, and produced a silver Sharpie. He signed the back of the Polaroid with an exaggerated flourish, then handed her the pen. She scrawled her signature beneath his, two names now fused in chemical emulsion and ink. She tucked the photo into the bodice of her ruined gown like a talisman. Midnight crept toward dawn. Rain tapered to a hush. Thad suggested they attempt sleep, but Kalista shook her head, claiming adrenaline would only resurge in nightmares. She proposed making coffee. He countered with the idea of building a pillow fort in the media room, something absurd enough to outwit lingering dread. 20 minutes later they lounged inside a fortress of throw pillows and cashmere blankets, the 40-foot screen streaming silent black and white films while city lights flickered beyond the glass. Kalista dozed first, cheek pressed to Thad's shoulder. He remained awake, listening to the steadiness of her breathing, the city's muted sirens, and the faraway clink of the cleaning crew clearing crystal debris 3 floors below. He realized the contract's iron logic had already rusted in the presence of something messier and more resilient. He wondered how many clauses would fracture before dawn. Outside, the sky lightened from indigo to pearl. Thad closed his eyes at last, and as sleep edged in he pictured the chandelier frozen in midair, prisms scattering light, a moment suspended between catastrophe and salvation. In that suspended space, he found the shape of possibility, a narrative no board could script, no clause could cage, and no chandelier could crush. Morning arrived like a spotlight, too bright and too sudden, dragging Thad from a shallow doze on the media room floor. His phone vibrated with stacked notifications, news alerts about the chandelier incident, frantic texts from the public relations team, and a summons from the board for an emergency session at 10. He nudged Kalista awake, her hair a copper tied across the pillow fort, and together they faced the blur of handlers who had invaded the penthouse with garment bags, makeup kits, and crisis management talking points. By 9:30 they were seated side by side in the 37th floor boardroom, a horseshoe of glass overlooking the Hudson. Kalista wore a tailored charcoal jumpsuit hastily couriered from a stylist, the bandage on her cheek visible but discreet. Thad had swapped the plaster-dusted suit for navy pinstripes yet kept the faint bruise on his jaw. The publicist had suggested concealer, but he wanted the mark visible, a silent rebuke to whoever had tried to erase him. The directors filed in, 11 men and women whose net worths could tilt currencies. They greeted Thad with sympathetic smiles that never reached their eyes, then shifted their attention to Kalista, assessing the unorthodox woman who had become the corporation's firewall overnight. At the far end sat Zephyr Lowell, the lead auditor, a lean figure in tortoiseshell glasses who seemed to absorb every detail into some internal ledger. The meeting opened with legal updates. The fire marshal had ruled the chandelier's fall suspicious, pending full investigation. Insurance adjusters were en route. The press office reported a surge in social media engagement, sympathy trending high, share price wobbling but stable. Thad listened, fingers steepled, but his gaze kept sliding to Zephyr, who had yet to speak. When the floor was yielded, Zephyr rose and connected a tablet to the wall display. Lines of financial data cascaded across the screen: maintenance invoices, electronic transfers, subcontractor ledgers. Zephyr's voice was low yet carried the hush of inevitability. 3 weeks before the wedding, a dormant account within the Meriwether Vox Charitable Foundation had wired $25,000 to a private electrical firm responsible for chandelier inspections. The payment was disguised as a grant for historical preservation but contained no corresponding paperwork. A murmur rippled around the table. Thad felt the room tilt the way the chandelier had tilted, slow at first, then terrifying in its momentum. Zephyr advanced the slide, CCTV stills of a man entering the Athenaeum service door the night before the ceremony, toolbox in hand, face obscured by a hood. Payment receipts traced back to a shell company headquartered in Delaware, whose registered agent handled hundreds of anonymous LLCs. Zephyr concluded with a flat statement: the transaction bore hallmarks of an inside job, and the shell company was linked through 3 layers of ownership to Knox Family Holdings, an entity controlled by Harlan Knox, Thad's older half-brother. Silence slammed down like a gavel. Harlan, absent from the meeting under the guise of a business trip, suddenly loomed in every mind, the charming heir apparent who had never forgiven their father for naming Thad CEO. A director cleared his throat, suggesting caution before casting blame. Zephyr replied that the evidence was preliminary but compelling, and further subpoenas were already in motion. Thad inhaled, the air sharp as winter, and thanked Zephyr. He then turned to the board, voice steady, announcing he would personally oversee the investigation and temporarily reassign Harlan's duties. The directors nodded, relieved to delegate the ugliness, but one of them, Dahlia Reyes, head of the compensation committee, asked how Thad intended to reassure investors during the scandal. Without missing a beat, he gestured to Kalista. He said the company would launch a transparency initiative, pairing Meriwether Vox journalists with independent artists to document corporate accountability from the inside. Kalista, as both wife and renowned photojournalist, would lead the pilot. The proposal was audacious, risky, and impossible to oppose without appearing anti-transparency. Dahlia raised an eyebrow yet conceded it was bold. The board approved the plan by acclamation, contingent on legal review. Meeting adjourned. In the hallway, Zephyr approached Thad and Kalista, lowering his voice. He believed the shell company trail was just the surface. Money had moved through cryptocurrency mixers, offshore trusts, even art auctions. Zephyr suggested a covert partnership. He would dig through financial labyrinths if they, with their new transparency project, could provide cover and perhaps coax loose lips in the social sphere Harlan frequented. Thad agreed, and Kalista proposed they start that very night at a gala Harlan was rumored to attend, a benefit for avant-garde theater held in a converted power station. They spent the afternoon in separate orbits of preparation. Kalista retreated to her studio loft in Williamsburg to develop the film from the ruined wedding, the darkroom lit by the red glow of safe lights. As images bloomed in chemical baths, she lingered on one frame. Thad crouched beside her amid shattered crystal, his eyes lit with raw gratitude. She pinned the wet print to a drying line, aware that the photograph was both evidence and talisman. Meanwhile, Thad met with corporate security, instructing them to discreetly track Harlan's communications but to avoid any move that might tip their hand. He then visited the staff gym, pummeling a heavy bag until sweat blurred his vision, channeling betrayal into kinetic clarity. Showered and suited in midnight black, he arrived at the penthouse an hour before the gala to find Kalista waiting, dressed in a backless emerald gown that made the bandage on her cheek appear almost ornamental. She carried the Leica but had swapped the usual lens for a compact prime, easier to conceal. In the limo they rehearsed their public choreography, affectionate but not saccharine, confident but not smug. Yet beneath the performance plan lay coded signals they had devised via encrypted texts that afternoon, touch patterns and key phrases that would translate into intel updates. A squeeze of 3 fingers meant Harlan had arrived. A touch to the bandage meant Zephyr had sent new data. A whispered line from Hamlet, "What a piece of work is man," meant extraction needed, immediately. The gala venue shimmered with projected light art, transforming old turbine halls into rivers of color. Music thrummed, champagne flowed, and the city's elite mingled in curated abandon. Thad and Kalista entered to a buzz of camera flashes. She captured the swarm from within, spinning on stiletto heels to photograph the paparazzi themselves, a recursive spectacle that delighted the crowd. 30 minutes in, Kalista spotted Harlon near the central installation, laughing with a venture capitalist and a Broadway producer. She signaled Thad with the three-finger squeeze. Thad, gripping a tumbler of soda disguised as scotch, drifted into the circle, greeting his half-brother with fraternal warmth that tasted like battery acid on his tongue. Harlon's eyes flicked to the bruise on Thad's jaw, then to Kalista's bandage, and for a heartbeat his smile faltered, as though the injuries reminded him the chandelier had failed. Kalista moved around them, snapping candid shots, listening. Harlon bragged about a soon-to-launch streaming service, dropping hints of investors whose names matched entities Zephyr had flagged. Each time Harlon mentioned a partner, Kalista touched her bandage, and Thad, catching the cue, memorized the detail. When Harlon excused himself to take a call, Thad followed at a distance, but security intercepted with a text. Harlon's phone had just pinged a location linked to the shell company server. In the crowd's dim periphery, Kalista noticed a man in a stagehand's black hoodie, an odd costume among tuxedos, slip through a side door. She sensed a pattern repeating, a worker, a hood, a quiet exit. Instinct overrode caution. She told a nearby waiter she needed the restroom, then trailed the man down an industrial stairwell lit by flickering fluorescents. The basement smelled of rust and ozone. Pipes snaked along concrete walls, and water dripped somewhere in the gloom. The hooded figure knelt by an electrical panel, toolkit open. Kalista raised the Leica, the shutters clicked sharp in the hush. The man jerked around, eyes wide, hand diving into the bag. Kalista's heart slammed, she expected a weapon. Instead he pulled a small device wired to a bundle of black cylinders, smoke canisters, she realized, rigged to the building's ventilation. The man cursed and lunged. Kalista backpedaled, snapping frames even as she stumbled. Footsteps thundered on the stairwell. Thad burst in, followed by venue security. The saboteur bolted, knocking over a toolbox, but guards tackled him before he reached the exit. In the scuffle, one canister rolled free. Kalista photographed the label, CS gas, military grade. Thad stared at the device, understanding that the plan had been to flood the gala with tear gas, triggering panic, humiliating him, and perhaps worse. Police arrived, handcuffing the saboteur. Kalista and Thad gave statements under the wail of sirens. She slipped the memory card from her camera into Thad's pocket, whispering that the images were leverage. Outside, Zephyr texted, the shell company had just attempted a mass deletion of files but his team captured the data before it vanished. In the limo ride back, city lights strobed through tinted glass. Thad's hand trembled on his knee until Kalista covered it with hers. He breathed, slower now, and said the chandelier had been the opening salvo. The tear gas plot was the escalation. Harlon, or whoever sat behind him, would not stop until Thad's credibility lay in ruins. Kalista replied that credibility was a fortress built of stories, and they happened to be storytellers. She retrieved her camera, removed the second memory card, and held it up between thumb and forefinger. On it were the faces of conspirators, the evidence of sabotage, and the unguarded moments of two people who had entered a contract and found something incendiary instead. Thad closed her fingers over the card, promising to protect the story and the woman who had risked everything to capture it. As the limo merged onto the bridge, the skyline unfolded, a jagged heartbeat against the night, and for the first time since the chandelier's fall, Thad felt not the weight of the empire on his shoulders but the momentum of an alliance no boardroom could measure. 3 weeks later a biting November wind blew off the Hudson, rattling the bay doors of a converted warehouse in Chelsea that now carried a discreet brass plaque, Rowan Merriweather Project Space. Inside, the smell of fresh plaster and ink still clung to the whitewashed brick, but by dusk the gallery was ready, 38 prints mounted on floating frames, each lit by a narrow cone of track light that turned silver halide grain into something luminous. Kalista had worked 18-hour days with a small crew of art school assistants, sleeping on a cot between drying racks, waking to the click of the enlarger timer and the taste of fixer on her tongue. The show, Faces of Disquiet, would be her first major solo exhibition, yet it already felt less like a debut than a detonation. Thad arrived an hour before the doors opened, shoulders hunched against the cold, scarf whipping like a pennant. His security detail remained outside. Tonight he wanted no buffer between himself and whatever storm the photographs might summon. He found Kalista in the back studio, hands stained with developer, hair twisted into a makeshift knot secured by a binder clip. She was hanging the final piece, a contact sheet collage of every frame she had shot in the minutes before the chandelier fell, the sequence showing Thad turning toward her, the blur of her lunge, the explosion of crystal. She stepped off the ladder and regarded him with the tight-smiled exhaustion of someone who had poured secrets into paper and chemicals. He asked if she was ready. She said readiness was a myth, courage was just forward motion despite the knot in the gut. She peeled off her nitrile gloves, revealing the silver band on her ring finger, and took his hand. Together they walked the exhibition path she had laid out like a breadcrumb trail through corporate facades. The first room featured portraits of gig economy workers whose livelihoods hinged on Merriweather Vox's algorithmic news feeds, a rideshare driver asleep in the back seat of his Prius, a freelance moderator staring at a screen of flagged hate speech, a teenage content creator filming dance tutorials in a kitchen stacked with eviction notices. Each subject held a small mirror, reflecting the camera lens, implicating the viewer. In the second room the prints grew larger, darker. Kalista had photographed board members in candid moments, Dahlia Reyes caught mid-yawn during a philanthropic luncheon, another director wiping caviar from his tie at a disaster relief fundraiser. Kalista had obtained access by flashing her new surname, the irony was carved into every gelatin silver tone. Thad stopped before a portrait of himself he had never seen, shot the night they built the pillow fort. He sat barefoot on the marble floor, suit trousers wrinkled, gaze lifted toward something outside the frame. In the photo his vulnerability was unvarnished, the bruise on his jaw stark. He felt the gallery's cool air against his skin, as if the print had opened a window inside his chest. They reached the final chamber, its walls painted a matte charcoal that swallowed the spill of light from the hallway. Only 3 images hung here, each over 4 feet tall. The first showed the chandelier wreckage, jagged shards glittering like fallen constellations. The second depicted the smoke canister rolling across the power station floor, guards lunging, Kalista's own shoe caught mid-stride. The third image dominated the far wall, an autopsy-style portrait of Kalista in her ruined wedding gown, blood blossom vivid against silk, Leica dangling at her side. She faced the camera head-on, eyes unflinching, the bandage a white slash of defiance. Underneath, stamped in block serif, was the exhibition's epigraph, "Nothing valuable survives in the dark." Thad exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He asked if she understood the risk, the board would see the show as a declaration of war. Kalista answered that the war had already begun when someone loosened a chandelier cable. Tonight she was merely switching on the floodlights. At 7 sharp the first guests arrived, critics from Art Forum, editors from Rolling Stone, venture philanthropists, fashion bloggers, and a smattering of Merriweather Vox staff curious to witness whatever controversy their boss's wife had cooked up. Zephyr Lowell slipped in quietly, nodding to Thad, tapping his phone to indicate fresh intel. Harlan Knox was notably absent, but whispers circulated that he had flown back from Zurich on an overnight jet and might appear. Wine glasses clinked, flash bulbs popped, and the temperature of the room rose as bodies pressed close to study the prints. The ride-share driver recognized himself and wept softly. A tech influencer posted a selfie with the chandelier wreckage behind her, captioned with a broken heart emoji. Somewhere near the exit a man in a tailored camel coat was overheard muttering that the show was a breach of fiduciary duty. Kalista moved through the throng like a conductor, answering questions about exposure times and ethical obligations, her bandage now replaced by a thin strip of surgical tape that glinted under the lights. Halfway through the evening Thad's phone buzzed with a secure message from Zephyr, offshore account traced to Harlon emptied at 1843, funds redirected to anonymous wallet. Possible flight risk. Thad typed back one word, understood, then turned toward the makeshift stage near the gallery's loading dock where a microphone and small monitor waited. He had planned a short speech praising artistic bravery, but a different speech had been forming in his mind since the chandelier crash. He walked onto the platform and felt the chatter die down. Kalista paused beside the contact sheet collage, eyes narrowing as she sensed the shift in atmosphere. Thad cleared his throat, the mic squeaking. He thanked the audience for supporting Kalista's vision. Then he pivoted. He spoke of the power of narrative, how corporations sell stories to shape markets, how sometimes those stories stray so far from truth that the scaffolding rots. He confessed that months earlier the Merriweather Vox board had delivered an ultimatum: project a family-friendly image or relinquish leadership. He admitted he had entered a contractual marriage to protect thousands of employees and a legacy he wasn't sure he deserved. Gasps scattered through the crowd like popping corn. Reporters raised phones, the gallery's Wi-Fi surged. Thad continued, explaining that what began as optics had collided with reality in a shower of crystal and smoke. He gestured toward Kalista's self-portrait, saying that the woman who saved his life also saved his conscience, forcing him to confront the cost of deception. He announced the immediate launch of the Transparency Initiative. Internal archives would be open to independent journalists, corporate political contributions would be published in real time, and an employee-elected oversight council would hold veto power over any editorial interference from shareholders. A hand shot up, Miranda Keene from the Wall Street Ledger, asking if shareholders might sue for breach of duty. Thad answered that truth was the highest duty. Another reporter asked if his marriage was still contractual. Thad looked across the gallery, found Kalista's gaze, and said contracts could be rewritten. In the stunned lull that followed, a commotion erupted at the entrance. Harlan Knox strode in flanked by two lawyers and a woman Thad recognized as the public relations consultant who had first suggested the marriage scheme. Harlan's eyes were bloodshot, jaw tight. He marched straight to the stage, microphone feedback shrieking as he grabbed a second mic. He accused Thad of reckless self-aggrandizement, claimed the chandelier incident was a tragic accident, dismissed the tear gas plot as conspiracy fiction. He warned that tanking share price would gut pension funds and layoffs would follow. The crowd shifted, tension coiling. Kalista stepped forward, camera raised, lens trained on Harlan's contorted face. She spoke without amplification, voice cutting through the noise. I have footage of the electrician you hired to sabotage the wedding and the gala. She held up a tablet linked to Zephyr's secure cloud. The screen displayed time-stamped videos, financial ledgers, a passport scan showing Harlan's alias. Gasps turned to murmurs, murmurs to outrage. Harlan's lawyers whispered urgently, but he lunged for the tablet. Security intercepted. In the scuffle, Kalista's camera hit the floor, skittering across polished concrete. Thad left the stage, placing himself between Harlan and Kalista. He said the board would convene an emergency vote to suspend Harlan, and criminal charges would follow. Harlan spat that the board was already in his pocket. At that moment Dahlia Reyes emerged from the crowd, phone held high, stating that 7 directors had just resigned via email, unwilling to defend attempted manslaughter. Harlan's bravado sagged like a punctured sail. Police officers, tipped off by Zephyr, entered and placed him under arrest for conspiracy, assault, and securities fraud. Flash bulbs exploded as Harlan was led out, cuffs glinting. The gallery settled into a brittle quiet. Kalista knelt, retrieving her Leica, the lens cracked but the body intact. She whispered that the break would make the next shots more interesting, a flaw turning light in unpredictable ways. Thad crouched beside her, touching the damaged metal, and said unpredictability had become his favorite element of design. Outside, news vans had already formed a phalanx, satellite dishes swiveling like sunflowers. Share prices dipped in after-hours trading, but social media sentiment soared with hashtags praising whistleblowers and art as resistance. In the office of a late-night talk show, a producer greenlit an emergency segment titled Love, Lies, and Chandeliers. Back in the dimmed gallery, guests lingered before the final triptych, some wiping tears, others texting furiously. Kalista excused herself to the darkroom. Thad followed, finding her alone amid chemical trays, the faint red glow painting her skin. She was holding the wet print of his barefoot portrait, droplets sliding down the emulsion like rain on a window. She said she needed to fix it properly, but her hands were shaking. He took the print, dipped it into the fixer bath, agitated gently, watching the image stabilize, blacks deepening, whites clearing. When the timer dinged, he lifted the photograph, water streaming, and pinned it on the line beside the ruin-gowned self-portrait. 2 images, side by side, raw and unfiltered, truth drying in the open air. Kalista leaned against him, exhaustion collapsing into relief. She said that when she crossed out the no feelings clause, she hadn't predicted how messy the alternative would be. He replied that mess was where life hid its brightest colors. In the hush of the darkroom they kissed for the first time without cameras or contracts, the developer fumed sharp, the fixer acrid, and somewhere beyond the closed door the city roared at the taste of scandal and redemption. When they emerged, Zephyr was waiting with a flash drive containing the frozen assets of Knox Family Holdings and a draft press release for the Transparency Initiative. He handed it to Thad, adding that regulators would likely descend by morning. Thad thanked him, then turned to Kalista, asking if she was ready for another sleepless night, this time writing the story together. She smiled, touching the cracked lens of her Leica, and said she had a headline in mind, Empire Exposed, Hearts Uncaged. Outside, the wind had died, leaving the river glassy under moonlight. Sirens receded, camera crews packed up, and the warehouse district settled into post-industrial quiet. Inside the gallery the track lights remained on, illuminating prints that would travel the world as evidence that art could topple dynasties. Thad and Kalista locked the doors behind them, stepping into the street hand in hand, the flash drive warm in his pocket, the camera warm in hers, each holding a piece of a future that no longer fit inside any frame. The first hearing of the State Securities Commission convened at dawn in a paneled chamber overlooking Foley Square, the air heavy with the smell of old leather and fresh scandal. Thad took his seat at the witness table in a navy suit still creased from a sleepless night. Kalista slipped in behind the press rail, her Leica stowed for once, a yellow legal pad in her lap. Harlan Knox, flanked by attorneys, occupied the opposite side, wrists free of cuffs but ringed by the invisible iron of bail conditions. The commissioners recited oaths and disclaimers, but the room crackled with a hunger for revelation no protocol could mute. Harlan's counsel opened with an attack on the provenance of the evidence, doctored ledgers, deepfake video, an artist's flair for manipulation. He portrayed Harlan as the victim of a vendetta orchestrated by a jealous half-brother and a fame-seeking wife. Thad kept his eyes forward, jaw locked, until the lawyer invoked the phrase, manufactured martyrdom. A flicker of anger crossed Kalista's face, and she began to write, shorthand loops that would later become captions. Zephyr Lowell, subpoenaed as a neutral expert, testified next. He detailed the money trail to Knox Family Holdings, the shell corporations, the attempted deletions. His presentation was crisp, almost surgical, and the commissioners nodded along. Yet as Zephyr spoke, Kalista noticed something incongruous. The timestamps on a set of security camera stills differed by 23 seconds from the metadata in her own photographs of the same corridor. It was small, but small errors had toppled alibis before. She circled the numbers, slid the pad to Thad when no one was looking. He read, blinked, and tucked the page into his portfolio. At recess they cornered Zephyr in a marble alcove. Thad asked about the discrepancy. Zephyr shrugged, different systems drift, nothing sinister. But his pupils constricted, and he ended the conversation too quickly, retreating to a call that seemed more pantomime than necessity. Kalista watched him pace, phone at his ear yet screen dark, and felt the first chill of misgiving. Back at Merriweather Vox headquarters, Thad convened an emergency data team in a windowless sub-basement lined with humming servers. Kalista handed over the Leica's full card, engineers extracted GPS stamps, compared them to the commission exhibits, and built a time-sync model. Within an hour a pattern emerged. Every file that implicated Harlon had passed through Zephyr's audit server before reaching investigators. In each, the system clock was offset, sometimes by seconds, sometimes by whole minutes, always in ways that reinforced the narrative of Knox's guilt. Thad paced the server room, the fluorescence carving hard angles across his features. If Zephyr had forged evidence, the Empire had merely traded one saboteur for another. Kalista, staring at the scrolling code, wondered aloud what motive the auditor might have beyond professional malice. A young analyst answered without looking up, short positions. 2 hedge funds had quietly borrowed millions of shares to sell short the morning after the chandelier crash, both funds traced back to a Cayman entity where Zephyr Lowell sat on the advisory board. The revelation landed like a punch. Zephyr had engineered chaos, framed Harlon, and bet on the company's collapse, then reinvented himself as savior to tighten the noose. Thad felt the sting of naivete. He had trusted the auditor because cynicism toward family had blinded him to treachery by outsiders. They needed proof ironclad enough to withstand courtroom cross-examination. Kalista proposed a trap. Zephyr believed she worshipped documentation. She would feed him a false trail, an encrypted drive of new photos tying Harlon to an off-ledger payment. If Zephyr moved to plant the material officially, they would have him on entrapment and evidence tampering. That night she drafted an email on a burner account, claiming anonymous provenance and offering the drive in exchange for a donation to a vague advocacy group. She sent it to Zephyr's private address, which she had once glimpsed on a conference badge. Less than an hour later he replied from a Manhattan hotel suite, asking to meet in person to verify authenticity. The hook was set. Thad insisted on accompanying her, though Kalista argued he would spook the prey. They compromised. She would go in alone, wearing a wire. Thad and a pair of federal agents would monitor from an adjacent room. She slipped into black jeans and a leather jacket, bandage gone now, scar a thin crescent catching the hall light. She tucked a flash drive, blank except for a looping video of a sleeping cat, into her pocket and walked the corridor as though on a tightrope strung above lava. Zephyr opened the door in shirt sleeves, tie loosened, the facade of overwork masking the thrill of predation. He poured 2 whiskeys, gestured to a laptop on the desk, asked to see the files. Kalista placed the drive on the glass, but as he reached for it she hesitated, saying she wanted to know his endgame. Why gamble everything? Zephyr's smile thinned. He spoke of market efficiencies, of legacy media ripe for disruption, of making history by dismantling a dinosaur. He said Thaddeus lacked the ruthlessness required for survival. Someone had to accelerate the extinction event and profit from the bones. Kalista, heart jackhammering, asked why frame Harlon instead of Thad. Zephyr's answer was chilling in its banality. Brother against brother sold better, the narrative would write itself. He plugged in the drive. The laptop screen filled with the looping cat. Zephyr frowned, tapped keys. Kalista stepped back. Agents burst through the adjoining door, badges up. Zephyr tried to yank the drive, but one agent pinned his wrist while the other recited Miranda rights. Hidden cameras captured everything: confession, attempted destruction of evidence, the flash of panic as empire-toppling schemes collapsed into stainless steel cuffs. The next morning Thad and Kalista returned to the commission chamber with the footage. Harlon's lawyers pounced, moving to dismiss all charges. The commissioners recessed to deliberate, and when they returned they announced suspension of proceedings against Knox pending criminal referral of Zephyr Lowell. Harlon, pale and shaking, thanked his attorneys but did not look at his half-brother on the way out. The rivalry that had fueled so much damage suddenly felt small beside the scope of Zephyr's conspiracy. In the hallway Kalista faced Thad, exhaustion etched beneath her eyes. She confessed a secret she had carried since the night of the chandelier. She had opened the dormant charitable sub-account herself, funneling a small test payment through it weeks earlier to see whether any internal controls would flag the anomaly. She had planned an exposé on corporate complacency, never imagining someone else would hijack the channel for sabotage. The knowledge had haunted her, but she feared revealing it would derail the hunt for the real mastermind. Now that the danger had passed, she owed him the truth. Thad absorbed the admission in silence. The old fear of betrayal flared, then ebbed as he recalled the shove that saved his life, the nights of shared bourbon and sleepless strategy. He realized trust was not the absence of secrets but the courage to reveal them. He reached for her hand, and the corridor's bustle receded until there was only the thrum of two pulses finding common tempo. That evening they stood on the penthouse terrace watching the city glitter like circuitry. Kalista's Leica, newly repaired, hung at her hip. She raised it, framing Thad against the skyline. He laughed, asking if every chapter of their lives would be documented. She answered that photography was her way of promising memory, she wanted proof that the moment existed. He stepped into the viewfinder, kissed her, and the lens fogged with breath. Below, news tickers scrolled with headlines: auditor arrested in Merriweather saga, stock surges on transparency pledge, artist CEO couple defies corporate playbook. For once the narrative felt aligned with the messy, luminous truth. Inside, a single envelope waited on the kitchen counter, board minutes formally reinstating Thad as CEO with full confidence and appointing an interim audit chief selected by the new employee council. Beneath the letter lay a slim contract Kalista had drafted on printer paper: Clause 1, love without expiry; Clause 2, art without apology; Clause 3, mutual veto over any story told in their name. No signatures yet, just space enough for ink when they were ready. The city's wind curled around them, carrying distant horns and nearer possibilities. Thad asked what she saw through the lens. Kalista lowered the camera, eyes bright. She said she saw an empire rebuilt on negative space, the places where light rushes in when old structures fall. He nodded, understanding that the next frame would be theirs to expose together, shutter by deliberate shutter, until the story was no longer shocking but simply, irrevocably, alive. The winter sun spilled through the penthouse windows in a pale ribbon, painting the hardwood floors with the hush of a Sunday before the markets opened. Thad stood barefoot at the stove whisking cardamom into oatmeal, an indulgence he had adopted from Kalista's morning rituals. She perched on a stool, knees pulled to her chest, scrolling through a draft of the Transparency Initiative's first public report. Overnight, the legal team had pared the document to 60 pages, leaving intact every admission of past lobbying expenditures and every line item from executive travel budgets. She underlined a sentence about community reinvestment and suggested stronger language. He nodded without looking up, stirring the pot until the oats thickened to the consistency she liked. Domesticity felt improbable yet unforced, as though it had always been coded into the blueprint of the penthouse, waiting for them to inhabit it. The quiet broke when Thad's phone chimed with a call from the exchange floor. He answered, expecting a routine update, but his posture stiffened. After a terse thank you he hung up and told Kalista that the board, newly purged and restaffed, had voted to accelerate the IPO. They wanted a roadshow in 3 weeks, citing bullish sentiment after the scandal's resolution. Kalista's eyebrows rose. 3 weeks was a sprint in a marathon world, but Thad only half smiled and said the timing felt right. The company had spent years scripting illusions, why delay showing investors the unvarnished machinery? By mid-afternoon a war room materialized in the dining area. Designers pinned slide mock UPS to corkboards, data analysts argued over valuation models, a junior associate brewed coffee until the air smelled like ambition. Amid the frenzy Kalista wandered to the balcony, seeking a sliver of sky. Below, the west side highway glittered with traffic, but her thoughts drifted inland to a quieter corridor, the gallery where faces of disquiet still hung behind locked doors, awaiting the next city on its tour. She realized she missed the hum of the enlarger, the chemical alchemy that turned blank paper into confession. She turned to find Thad watching her through the glass, his expression unreadable. That night they attended a small charity dinner for independent journalism, the first public appearance since Zephyr's arrest. Cameras popped, reporters shouted questions, but the tone had shifted. They were no longer curiosities in a corporate soap opera but avatars of reform. During dessert the host auctioned off a single lot, a private portrait session with Kalista in her darkroom. Bidding escalated until an anonymous paddle secured the session for a sum large enough to fund 3 regional investigative projects. Kalista caught Thad's eye across the table. He shrugged, lips quirked, and she suspected the anonymous bidder had a familiar bank account. Back at the penthouse they found an envelope slipped beneath the door, the ivory stock embossed with a governmental seal. Inside lay a draft of new ethics guidelines from the Securities Commission, inspired by Meriwether Vox's initiative. A sticky note in the chairwoman's hand invited Thad and Kalista to co-author the public foreword. Kalista traced the seal with her thumb, surprised by the sudden weight of influence. Influence had toppled chandeliers and ruined men, now it offered to rebuild. She wondered if they were ready to wield it without losing themselves. Sleep came fitfully. Around 3 a.m. Kalista woke to find Thad standing at the window, city lights skimming the angles of his face. He admitted he was thinking about his father, a man who had believed vulnerability was a liability. Thad worried that investors might equate transparency with weakness. Kalista slipped beside him, resting her head on his shoulder, and said vulnerability was only weakness when disguised as something else. She reminded him that the market rewarded authenticity now more than ever, the proof flickered in ticker symbols scrolling across every screen. He kissed her temple, tasting the salt of insomnia, and asked if she trusted him enough to gamble the empire on that premise. She said she trusted the space between the shutter's click and the image's reveal. There, truth always emerged, and she trusted him to stand still in that space. 3 weeks telescoped into 3 sleepless blurs, flights to Boston, Chicago, and Palo Alto, town hall meetings live-streamed to employees, a detour to Omaha where a legendary investor grilled Thad on data privacy safeguards while Kalista photographed warehouse staff packing archival newspapers. At each stop Thad opened with an unscripted anecdote, often self-deprecating, always specific. He spoke of the chandelier, of the tear gas canister, of the day he realized quarterly earnings meant nothing if the journalists who generated them feared their own bosses. Investors listened, brows furrowed, then leaned forward when spreadsheets confirmed that candor, oddly enough, correlated with growth. The roadshow closed in New York at a theater once used for vaudeville, spotlights carving dust motes into gold. The final slide faded and the house lights rose to a standing ovation more fitting for a Broadway debut than a securities pitch. The next morning, under gray dawn, they stood together on the floor of the exchange, waiting for the opening bell. Kalista's Leica hung from her neck, its repaired lens glinting under fluorescent glare. Thad's mother, once skeptical of the marriage, clasped Kalista's hands and whispered that courage looked good on her. Harlon, released on bail and fighting a new civil suit from shareholders, did not attend, though his absence felt less like a wound than a closed chapter. When the bell rang, confetti cannons fired and the stock ticker lit up green. The first trade printed at a price 10% above guidance. Cheers erupted, cameras swung, analysts tweeted exclamation-heavy praise. Amid the swirl, Thad leaned toward Kalista and said the empire had survived truth's incursion. She corrected him, the empire had survived because of it. 2 weeks later, with the IPO quiet period over, they retreated to the Catskills, borrowing a friend's cedar-scented cabin beside a half-frozen lake. Snow muffled the world, cell service flickered, time stretched. One afternoon Thad set logs ablaze in the stone fireplace and pulled a thin sheaf of paper from his duffel. It was the unsigned contract she had drafted, love without expiry, art without apology, mutual veto over stories told in their name, but he had added a final clause, number 73, written in his angular hand: should either party doubt the truth of their union, they must declare it aloud and immediately seek evidence together, photographic or otherwise. Kalista laughed, a bright burst against the hush, and fetched a tube of crimson lipstick from her coat. She pressed a kiss beside the clause, then handed him a fountain pen. He signed beneath the lipstick, ink bleeding into wax, a document sealed by pigment and pledge. Evening settled, and they ventured onto the frozen lake, camera in tow, tripod legs splayed on the ice. Kalista set the timer for 10 seconds, then ran to join him at the center, their breaths pluming in twin clouds. The shutter clicked, capturing them mid-laugh, boots slipping, sky-bruised lavender behind spruce silhouettes. Later, back inside, they watched the image materialize on the laptop screen, 2 figures blurred slightly by motion, yet unmistakably anchored to each other against a vast, uncertain landscape. Spring returned with headlines proclaiming Merriweather Vox the case study of the decade, profits up, employee churn down, investigative journalism awards piling in. Faces of disquiet opened at the Tate Modern, queues snaking along the Thames. Kalista taught a master class at ICP, urging students to photograph not what they feared but what they almost dared to hope. Thad launched a grant for startups developing open-source fact-checking tools, citing the need for guardians outside traditional walls. One rainy Friday they stood on the steps of City Hall where a judge certified their amended marriage license, the clerk remarking that it was the first she'd seen citing mutual veto over narrative. Thad offered to carry Kalista across the threshold for tradition's sake, she countered by hoisting the Leica and snapping his surprised grin. The judge laughed, stamping the form, saying any union resilient enough to survive sabotage, short sellers, and art critics would likely endure municipal bureaucracy as well. That night, back at the penthouse, they pinned the City Hall photograph beside the chandelier wreckage print and the pillow fort snapshot, a triptych of calamity, transition, and calm. Kalista stepped back, arms crossed, assessing the composition. She mused that stories never truly end, they only recede into the negative space until new light calls them forward. Thad wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder, and said that whatever frames awaited, they would face the glare together. Outside, the skyline shimmered, each window a pixel in the vast mosaic of a city forever rewriting itself. Inside, the Leica rested on the coffee table, lens cap off, as though anticipating the next moment worth preserving. And somewhere between the hush of the shutter and the rush of the future, two people who had once signed away their hearts to save an empire now guarded that empire by keeping those hearts stubbornly, gloriously open.